a popular refrain within our circles is no more brother wars. But is this the lesson to draw from history? Well, this is a denunciation of and a reaction to, the senseless slaughter of World Wars I and II, where, millions of ordinary white British and French and German and American and Russian and Italian, common people kind of murdered each other for, the vague self-serving agendas of treacherous elites or, alien infiltrators who were ultimately the beneficiaries of those conflicts, not ordinary people, who bore the costs. And so, while I understand the origin of this sentiment and I understand its appeal, it's not totally correct because there's at least one more brother war to go, right? Those elites, those hostile elites and those alien infiltrators, they're still firmly entrenched, and their ideologies are firmly entrenched, and their treachery and parasitism has trickled down the ranks and influenced and assimilated, loads of other treacherous parasites. And, all these people who are in thrall to these hostile parasitic ideologies promulgated by these, hostile treacherous elites and these hostile alien infiltrators. All of the people, in their service will need to be dealt with. And a lot of those people are ethnically, identical to us or similar to us. And so, in that sense, it will be a brother war. It will be a vast war and a total war and a world war because these problems are vast and they're total. And they encompass at least the entire Western world, if not a lot more, but definitely the Western world. So there's one more world war to go, and it's going to be a brother war. It's going to be a total war. But what about after that? Well, Western civilization has never been united or monolithic. It's always been many nations and many factions within many nations. And we've actually gone too far in recent, centuries and decades with like the United States and the European Union, like trying to unify Western civilization or parts of Western civilization to an unprecedented extent. And those institutions are simply too big to work. They're too big to serve our interests and represent us faithfully. And they're going to need to be broken down, and those powers devolved to smaller units. And so there's not going to be unity within Western civilization. It's not going to be a monolith, and that means, there's still room for conflict within Western civilization. And historically, conflict, even within Western civilization, was what helped to cultivate and maintain, like, the Western warrior ethos. Now, I understand there are plenty of non-Western threats and non-Western enemies, on which to practice that ethos, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be no conflict between Western nations or within Western nations. And also, traditionally, conflict was how we determined who rules. And so, that's a much more, I think, reliable method than others, like, democracy and voting. Because democracy and voting is ultimately just a proxy for violence. But it's one that's easy to corrupt, as we have seen, right? It's one that's easy to hijack with various shenanigans, and I'm not going to get into them all here. But whether you're talking about propaganda or mass importation of parasitic aliens to vote for leftist causes, or various other shenanigans that have been used to subvert and hijack democracy, it turns out, in all cases, not to be a cheaper alternative to warfare. That was, in its inception, democracy was a cheaper alternative to warfare. If the result is going to go the same way, it's cheaper to vote about it than to fight about it. That's the purpose of democracy. But if the results are going to diverge, as they have, for a variety of reasons, including women voting who don't fight, and if these shenanigans are being used to hack democracy and produce outcomes that are different than the likely outcomes of violent conflict, then violent conflict can be more, less costly and more productive than democracy. So in its inception, democracy was economical. It was a cost-saving measure. But those savings have been lost and reversed by shenanigans, frankly. And so, a return to violence for the purpose of establishing hierarchies is probably a good way to go. So there's that. And this is directly analogous to, the practice of dueling. A lot of people thought that dueling was barbaric, and that's why it was phased out, that it was costly, that all these people were dying in duels, and a lot of them were good people or productive people. But the flip side of that is bad people also die in duels. And it's a very effective way for, let's say, weeding out psychopaths. Because psychopaths are the type of people who are likely to provoke others to that extreme of challenging to a duel or accepting a duel. And if they have no fear, no remorse, and they do it over and over again, eventually it's going to catch up with them. They're going to be weeded out. And if it takes, a couple of good people, dying in order to achieve that end of weeding out a very destructive, parasitic, pathological individual from society, then that can be a worthwhile trade-off. So, and then there are the other benefits of dueling, the good manners and the honest dealings that result on a large scale from having this threat hanging over people, that people know there is a recourse to that. And so, not wanting to resort to shenanigans in the first place. And those are the unseen benefits. This is another case of the seen versus the unseen, right? The perennial problem. People always focus on what they can see, but what they can't see is not always so clear. And in this case, the costs of dueling are obvious. The people who die and the families that are, orphaned or whatever. But the benefits are less clear. However, they are there. They are real. And it's the same with, conflict as a means of establishing and maintaining hierarchy versus less costly methods like voting, which can start out less costly but get more and more costly over time until eventually, there is a return to violence because that is less costly than putting up with a fundamentally corrupt and parasitic democratic regime that has been thoroughly and totally corrupted. So, there is a place for conflict within Western civilization and between Western nations and within Western nations, not just between Western nations and non-Western threats and non-Western enemies. Now, I suppose this is where, things like the rules of war come in. We talk about war crimes and crimes against humanity and all this kind of bullshit. Fundamentally, these are protections to grant others who will grant those protections to you or who are willing to lose in order to, obtain those protections. Those have no place if they're not reciprocated. If people would make your defeat unbearable, and if they are playing to win by any means or by any cost, at any cost, then there's no reason not to do likewise, to reciprocate, to make their defeat unbearable, and to win over them at any cost, because defeat to those kind of enemies is not an option. So we've treated these rules of war, which are kind of analogous to the rules of dueling, right? Between gentlemen, between Western nations, as kind of like a universal right or a universal entitlement that everybody is entitled to, even if they would extend us no such mercies or no such benefits or no such protections. And frankly, that is bogus. That is giving them something for nothing. That is fighting mortal enemies, existential threats with, our hands tied behind our backs. And that is not practical. And that is what history has shown, the incredible folly of doing that. So while I don't totally support the notion of, no more brother wars, because I do think there is going to be one more brother war that of necessity will be, a world war and a total war. After that, we can revive, let's say the rules of war and all these kind of protections and conventions and stuff. We can return to a more gentlemanly form of conflict and give up total war within Western nations and between Western nations, while still preserving that option for external threats, existential threats of a non-Western origin.